The prairie stretched wide and hollow under the silver sigh of winter, each blade of grass frozen in a lean against the wind. The land, a sheet of old parchment, whispered songs too old for any tongue to name. Above, the stars wept light across a velvet sky, patient and eternal, watching a world too small to notice their sorrow. A cabin hunched low among the hills, its smoke a frail ribbon stitched into the night. It was no grand shelter, just timber stacked against loneliness, but it clung to life stubbornly, like a thorn in the ribs of winter. Inside, the fire cracked and spat, throwing nervous shadows against the walls. A man sat close to its heart, carving at a block of wood with a dull knife, though his eyes stared beyond the blade. His name was Elijah Cutter, born of dust and duty, and though young in years, life had carved its lines deep into his brow. His hair, dark as river mud, curled wild at the edges of his rough-cut coat. His hands, calloused and scarred, were made for hunting, for surviving, not for dreaming. Dreams were a fool's currency in a land that traded only in blood and bone. Elijah had built this cabin with his own 2 hands, each log set with more anger than hope. He had come west because there was nothing left behind him but graves and broken promises. Out here, a man could disappear into the emptiness and become less than a whisper. That suited him fine. He lived by the rule of the rifle and the axe, speaking only when the wind insisted on an answer. The settlers in the nearest town spoke of him in half-shrugs and wary glances, a hunter who had no use for God or company. That, too, suited him fine. But even the hardest men cannot silence the call of the wild when it comes hunting. That night, the wind carried more than the smell of pine and smoke. It carried a sound sharp enough to still a heartbeat, a cry so raw it seemed to tear a hole in the world itself. Elijah froze, knife slipping from his fingers onto the dirt floor. Another howl followed, long and low, and many voices joined it. Wolves, starved and reckless under the blood-hungry moon. Elijah rose, grabbing his rifle with the smoothness of habit. He pulled his coat tighter around him, stepped out into the teeth of the cold. His breath rose in ghosts before him, and each step crunched against the brittle ground. He followed the sound, boots sinking into drifts of snow that reached his knees. The prairie was a sea of white now, the hills smoothed over like the back of a sleeping beast. Every shadow could be a snare. Every whisper of movement a promise of death. He found them at the lip of a dry creek bed, the wolves circling something half-buried in the snow. Their bodies slunk low, muscles rippling beneath mangy hides, teeth flashing pale in the moonlight. Without thought, Elijah raised his rifle and fired into the sky. The crack of it shattered the night, sent birds shrieking from bare trees. The wolves flinched, yellow eyes flickering, then scattered into the dark. The thing in the snow did not move. Elijah cursed low under his breath, heart hammering. He slid down the bank, boots sliding on the frozen earth, and knelt by the figure. It was a woman. Her hair, black as raven's wings, was tangled across her face. Her skin, where it showed through the torn remnants of a dress, was a soft brown kissed by the sun that winter had forgotten. Her lips were cracked, trembling. She bled from a gash at her side, the blood too bright against the white. Elijah hesitated. Everything he had been taught screamed in his bones. Navajo. Enemy. Other. But something louder than fear stirred in him, something deeper, like the old songs his mother once sang in the twilight hours before memory turned her face away. He tucked the rifle under one arm, lifted the woman as gently as he could. She weighed less than a sack of grain, her warmth sinking into him even through the layers of wool and leather. She made no sound as he carried her back through the blizzard, only a small breathless hitch when the wind cut cruel. It was the sound of a bird too cold to sing. Inside the cabin, Elijah laid her by the fire, hands moving awkwardly. He peeled off her wet boots, wrapped her in every blanket he owned, stoked the fire high. He heated water, mixed the herbs he had learned to use from an old trapper long dead to the fever. She needed more than he could give. But he gave it anyway. Hours passed in the slow drip of melting ice. Elijah sat watch at her side, rifle within reach, though he could not say if it was to protect her or himself. Her breathing stayed thin, rattling against her ribs like a trapped sparrow. As dawn stretched pale fingers across the horizon, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and endless. For a long moment, they stared at each other, Two souls caught on the sharp edge of survival, both too proud to beg for mercy. She tried to sit up. Elijah's hand shot out, steadying her before he even thought. She stiffened under his touch, and he let go, stepping back as if burned. Neither spoke. Words would only muddy what was already a flood between them. Elijah moved to the corner, picking up the rifle, cradling it against his knee. His fingers drummed against the worn wood, mind warring with itself. He could not keep her here. If the town learned he had taken in a Navajo woman, they would come with ropes and torches and righteousness burning hotter than hellfire. They would not ask her name, or why the wolves had hunted her. They would only see skin and history and draw blood to match. He could end it now. A single shot. Quick. Quiet. No one would ever know. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She had pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders and was staring into the fire, her face unreadable. Not begging. Not pleading. Simply waiting. Elijah gritted his teeth. The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks into the air like tiny stars losing their grip on heaven. He saw his father's face, twisted with hate, hands heavy with the belt. Heard the old man's words slither from memory. You trust an Injun, boy, and you'll be gutted for it. But he also heard another voice, fainter, softer. His brother Samuel, before the fever took him. A heart's a heart, Eli. Don't matter what skin God wrapped it in. Elijah rose slowly, rifle hanging loose in his hand. The woman turned her head, just slightly. A strand of her hair caught the firelight, glowed like a coal. He saw then that she was not some savage ghost come to haunt him. She was a person. Beaten, bloodied, but alive. Clinging to life with a fierceness that shamed him. The rifle slipped from his grasp, landing against the floorboards with a soft thud. He exhaled, a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. It shook loose something inside him, something old and cracked and aching to heal. Without a word, he crossed to the table, ladled out broth from the pot into a battered tin cup, and set it on the ground near her. She watched him with those fathomless eyes, then, slowly, reached for the cup. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, but she drank. Elijah sank back onto his stool by the fire, rubbing a hand over his face, feeling the stubble scrape against his palm. Outside, the storm began to ease, the world softening into a hush. Inside, something quieter and far more dangerous began to grow. Trust, thin and fragile as spring's first blade of grass. It would not be enough to save them from the world beyond the hills. But it was enough, for now, to save them from each other. And sometimes, that was all a beginning needed. Morning slid across the prairie in soft ribbons of gold, catching on the frost that still clung stubbornly to every blade of grass and crooked fence post. Inside the cabin, the fire had dulled to a low, steady glow, painting the wooden walls in muted amber. The storm had moved on, but it had left its mark, a silence deeper than snow. Elijah Cutter sat stiffly by the hearth, his legs drawn up, his rifle once more resting across his knees. His eyes, red-rimmed from a night without sleep, never left the small figure bundled in his blankets. She had not spoken, had not tried to flee. She simply existed there, in that small pocket of warmth he had carved from the cold. It unsettled him more than any threat might have. He shifted, boots scraping against the floorboards, and she stirred slightly, one hand moving to shield her face from the timid morning light. Her skin, though bruised and battered, held a stubborn beauty, not the delicate beauty of porcelain, but the kind forged by wind and stone and endless sun. Elijah swallowed against the dryness in his throat. His mind battled itself, the old voices warring with the man he was trying, fumblingly, to become. It would be easy, part of him whispered. Easy to end this. No questions. No dangers. But his hands would not obey. The woman sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her movements were careful, measured. She regarded him, not with fear, but a quiet readiness, as though she had already faced the worst of what men could offer and found herself unbroken. Elijah set the rifle aside, the gesture as loud as a shouted truce. He stood, stretching the stiffness from his limbs, and moved to the stove. The stew he had cooked the night before had thickened into something more solid than liquid, but it was food, and food was something he could offer without stumbling over words. He ladled some into a battered tin plate and placed it on the floor midway between them, then stepped back. She watched him with those unreadable dark eyes, and for a moment he thought she might refuse, might throw it back at him as a statement of her pride. Instead, she inched forward, reaching for the plate with fingers that trembled more from weakness than fear. She ate in small, careful bites, never once looking away from him. Trust, if it existed at all, was still a far-off country. Elijah sat back down, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, studying the fire more than her. The heat prickled his skin but did little to thaw the cold knot coiled beneath his ribs. He needed to think. Keeping her here was a death sentence. The town would not forgive this kindness. They would see only betrayal, only the ancient grudges written into their bloodlines. And yet every fiber of him recoiled from the thought of turning her out, of leaving her to the wolves and the cold and the cruelty of men. His father's voice rose up from the grave, harsh and unyielding. You show mercy to the wrong sort, and you'll pay for it with your blood. But then came another memory, soft as worn leather, Samuel laughing, his hand steady as he mended a broken bird's wing, whispering, every life's a prayer, if you listen close enough. The woman finished the food, setting the plate gently back on the floor. She pressed her palms together lightly, in what might have been a thank you or simply a ritual he did not understand. Elijah cleared his throat, uncomfortable in the thickening silence. You got a name? He asked, voice rough from disuse. The woman blinked slowly, as if weighing the danger of answering. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and musical, each syllable carefully shaped. Atsa. The words settled between them, heavier than a stone, lighter than breath. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. It felt like accepting a burden he did not yet know how to carry. He wanted to ask what had happened, why she had been out there alone, bleeding and near death. But questions felt like stones thrown into a fragile glass pond, and he had already cracked enough in her world. Instead, he busied himself with tasks, gathering more firewood, boiling water to clean her wounds properly. He kept his hands busy, though his mind spun in useless circles. As he worked, he became aware of her watching him, not with suspicion, but with something gentler, curiosity, perhaps, or the beginnings of recognition. She did not fear him. Not yet. The realization filled him with a shame so raw he had to turn away, pretending interest in the arrangement of kindling near the hearth. Atsa drifted into uneasy sleep again, her body still weakened by injury and cold. Elijah moved lightly around the cabin, setting things in order. He could not remember the last time he had cared what the place looked like, but now every speck of dirt, every cracked mug seemed like a mark against him. He paused by the window, staring out at the endless white that rolled away from the cabin in all directions. The world out there was cruel and vast and indifferent. He had chosen it because it demanded nothing but survival, because it allowed him to be nothing more than a blade honed sharp by necessity. But now there was a life inside these walls that asked something more. He was not sure he could give it. Night crept in again, the sky deepening into indigo, the stars puncturing the dark like desperate prayers. The wind had died to a whisper, but its absence left the cabin feeling exposed, vulnerable. Elijah sat by the fire once more, his rifle leaning forgotten against the wall. He watched Atsa sleep, the rise and fall of her breath steadier now. He thought about the town, about the men who would ride out with guns and torches if they knew. He thought about the preacher, all stiff black coat and bellowed warnings, and about the widow who had once dared to love a man not approved by the council's cold decree. There was no safety in half measures. There was no future in fear. He rubbed his hands together slowly, feeling the heat of the fire seep into his cracked skin. Tomorrow he would need to decide. For now, he allowed himself the smallest of mercies, the simple, impossible act of choosing kindness one more time. As he banked the fire low and lay down on the hard-packed earth floor, he found his eyes drawn back to her. Atsa. A name shaped like a prayer he did not yet know how to pray. Sleep came slow, fitful, tangled with dreams he would not remember. When morning came again, it would bring the world with it, suspicion, judgment, choices sharp as knives. But for one night more, under the low roof of his meager shelter, a hunter and a hunted soul shared the fragile, stubborn breath of life. In a land that remembered only the hard and the cruel, it was enough to begin. Days folded over each other like pages worn thin by weather and time. The storm had passed, but its breath still lingered, painting the mornings with a brittle chill and lacing the nights with mist that clung to the window panes like half-forgotten dreams. Inside the cabin, a fragile rhythm began to take root, tentative and cautious as the first green shoot pushing through frost-hardened ground. Atsa moved about the space with quiet purpose, her strength returning in small, stubborn increments. She patched the torn seams of Elijah's coat with thread finer than any he owned, her fingers swift and sure despite the lingering stiffness in her wounded side. She ground herbs into powder and mixed them with snowmelt, creating salves that soothed the burns and blisters Elijah had long since learned to ignore. He watched her from the corner of his eye, unsure if gratitude or guilt weighed heavier on his heart. It shamed him, somehow, to see her tend to the wounds he hadn't noticed piling upon himself. He tried, in his clumsy way, to repay the balance. He carved a new pair of moccasins from deer hide for her, each stitch a silent apology. When she wore them, her steps grew lighter, less pained. She did not thank him aloud, but her glance, soft and brief, was worth more than 1,000 words. They spoke little. Words felt too large, too dangerous. Instead, they traded gestures. A bowl of stew placed closer to her seat by the fire, a folded blanket left where he knew she would find it. Trust was a language of its own, stitched slowly between them. Outside, the world remained hard and suspicious. Elijah traveled to town once a week for supplies, each visit bristling with tension he carried back with him like mud clinging to his boots. The settlers' eyes grew sharper, their greetings colder. Rumors, like seeds on the wind, needed no tending to take root. He told Atsa little of what was said beyond the ridge, but she knew. She read it in the lines carving deeper into his face, in the way his hand lingered near the rifle hanging by the door. Still, she stayed. Still, he built the fire higher each night to drive back the darkness. One evening, as dusk smeared the horizon in bruised violets and soft grays, Atsa sat by the window, weaving strips of leather into a shape Elijah could not name. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her mouth set in a line of quiet determination. He found himself watching her more often now, not with suspicion, but with a strange, aching fascination. There was a steadiness to her, a rootedness, as if she carried the memory of older mountains and deeper rivers in her blood. She looked up and caught him staring. Instead of looking away, she held his gaze, her eyes calm and unafraid. Something shifted between them, subtle as the turning of a leaf in the breeze. Later, when she handed him the finished piece, a woven charm meant to ward off evil spirits, he recognized the offering for what it was. A bridge. A beginning. He accepted it with both hands, bowing his head in awkward, silent thanks. In the following days, the distance between them lessened. He showed her how to chop wood without splintering the grain, how to set snares for rabbits near the creek's edge. She showed him how to brew tea from pine needles to stave off the sickness that traveled with the cold, how to mend a cracked kettle using river clay. Side by side, they became something more than strangers. Something more dangerous, too, in the eyes of a world that measured belonging by skin and blood. One night, as the fire dwindled into coals, a sound cracked the quiet open, hoofbeats pounding across frozen earth. Elijah was on his feet before thought caught up, rifle in hand, heart slamming against his ribs. Atsa moved silently to his side, her presence steadying him more than any weapon could. Through the warped glass of the window, they saw a lone rider approaching, the horse's breath fuming in the cold like a dragon exhaling. Elijah recognized him before the rider dismounted. Tom Granger, a man whose mouth twisted words into poison with the same ease he twisted rope into nooses. Tom hammered a fist against the door, shouting Elijah's name, voice thick with whiskey and hate. Elijah opened the door a crack, rifle hidden just out of sight. Tom leaned in, the stink of him foul and heavy. "We know what you're hiding, Cutter," he snarled, eyes flicking toward the thin thread of smoke curling from the chimney. "You think you can shelter a redskin and walk among decent folk? Ain't no mercy for traitors." Elijah said nothing, letting silence weigh heavier than any argument. Tom spat into the snow and mounted his horse, leaving behind words sharp as broken glass. "You got a choice, boy. Fix it, or we will." The hoofbeats faded into the night, but their echo stayed lodged deep in Elijah's chest. He closed the door slowly, resting his forehead against the rough wood. Behind him, Atsa stood very still, her face unreadable. He turned to her, the weight of the moment settling like a stone between them. She did not beg. She did not plead. Instead, she gathered her few belongings, the moccasins, the woven charm, a small pouch of herbs, and began to wrap herself in her worn cloak. She was leaving, not because she wanted to, because she would not be the cause of his ruin. Elijah moved without thinking, crossing the room in 3 long strides, catching her hand before she could slip into the night. Her hand was cold and small in his, but she did not pull away. For a long moment, they stood there, suspended between the life he had known and the life he had not yet dared to claim. The fire behind them crackled softly, throwing shadows against the walls. When he spoke, his voice was low, rough with things he could not name. "You don't have to go." Atsa looked up at him, something fierce and fragile burning in her gaze. Slowly, she unwrapped the cloak from her shoulders and let it fall to the floor. She stayed. They did not speak again that night. Words would have only broken the spell, scattered it like startled birds. Instead, they sat by the fire until sleep crept upon them like a soft, inevitable tide. In the days that followed, they prepared. Elijah built stronger shutters for the windows, set traps not just for animals but for men. Atsa taught him how to listen to the wind, to read its warnings hidden beneath its song. The bond between them, once gossamer thin, wove itself tighter with each shared breath, each small, fierce act of defiance. The world beyond their little cabin would not forget them. It would not forgive them. But inside these walls, in the stubborn embers of the cold, they forged something the world could not touch. Something wild. Something sacred. Something worth fighting for. And as another winter storm rolled across the prairie, rattling the windows and howling down the chimney, Elijah and Atsa sat close by the hearth, the firelight dancing across their faces, their hands almost, but not quite, touching. There was still fear. Still danger. Still 1,000 miles of hard road ahead. But there was also this. A beginning. A heartbeat shared against the darkness. And for now, that was enough. The days grew sharper, the light thin and brittle as spun glass. Snow no longer fell gently but scoured the earth, scraping over the cabin's walls like 1,000 desperate fingers. Elijah could feel the world tightening around them, a noose braided from old grudges and fresh suspicion. He rode into town less often now, and when he did, he kept his hat low and his answers lower. The general store, once a place of muted camaraderie, had turned cold, the faces behind the counter stiff with something more dangerous than anger, certainty. The preacher, a man called Reverend Harlan, had begun to preach from his steps rather than his pulpit, thick-voiced with fury, warning of corruption hidden in plain sight, of wolves in human skins, of the rot that kindness would bring. The settlers listened. Fear sharpened them faster than hunger. Elijah kept his purchases brief: salt, flour, lead for the rifle, and left without meeting anyone's gaze. He could feel their eyes on his back, 1,000 pinpricks of judgment trailing him all the way to the edge of town where the widow Allen's house leaned wearily against the endless sky. She was waiting for him this time, a basket in her arms, her thin frame wrapped in a shawl that had once been bright but now hung faded and limp. "Take this," she said without preamble, pressing the basket into his arms. "And be ready." Inside, he found a loaf of bread, a slab of salted meat, a small wrapped bundle of herbs that smelled faintly of safety. Elijah nodded once, the only thanks he trusted himself to give without breaking apart. Widow Allen had once loved a man whose skin did not match hers, and though the town had buried him with hands that looked pious and hearts that burned with hate, she had never bowed her head to them again. Back at the cabin, Atsa met him at the door. Her eyes searched his face, reading the tension there as easily as the tracks left by a passing herd. "They know," he said simply, setting the basket down. She nodded, as if she had expected no other ending. They moved through the days with a new, quiet urgency. Elijah dug a second well closer to the house in case the main one was poisoned. Atsa taught him how to find water hidden beneath certain types of moss, how to gather the bitter roots that would stave off hunger when the stores ran dry. They laid traps not just for the wolves, who grew bolder with each passing night, but for men. Sometimes, when the wind was right, Elijah swore he could hear voices riding its currents, angry, drunken, growing nearer. The nights became longer, the fire burning lower. They slept lightly, fully clothed, boots near at hand, weapons closer. One evening, just as the sun surrendered itself to the coming dark, Elijah found Atsa sitting outside the cabin, facing the horizon. In her lap lay a piece of cloth she had been embroidering, though now her hands lay still. He sat beside her, not speaking. Together, they watched the stars ignite one by one, each a stubborn declaration against the night. "You could leave," she said finally, her voice barely louder than the breeze. "You could say I forced you. You could save yourself." Elijah shook his head slowly. His throat felt too tight for words. She turned to him then, studying his face, searching for cracks in his resolve. There were none. Not any more. That night, as they sat by the fire, Elijah took a battered silver coin from his pocket, a keepsake from his brother, Samuel, polished smooth by years of worry. He handed it to Atsa without ceremony. She looked at it, then at him, understanding flashing between them like a bolt of heat lightning across a summer sky. A promise, unspoken but ironclad. The next day brought a brittle sort of peace, the kind that comes before a storm. Elijah split wood until his shoulders burned, stacking it neatly against the side of the cabin. Atsa smoked meat over the fire, braiding strips of it into ropes that could be carried easily should flight become necessary. Toward midday, the sound of hoofbeats cracked the air wide open. Elijah stiffened, hand instinctively going to the rifle slung over the doorframe. Atsa stood, wiping her hands on her skirt, her body coiled and ready. Through the swirling snow, a group of riders emerged. 5 men, hard-eyed and hunched against the cold. At their head rode Tom Granger, his face twisted in a sneer that spoke of cruelty made personal. Elijah stepped onto the porch, rifle resting against his shoulder, not raised yet, but not idle either. Granger reined his horse to a stop, spitting into the snow. "You had your warning, Cutter," he called, his voice oily with satisfaction. "Ain't no more time for second chances." Behind him, the other men shifted, hands brushing against gun handles, boots tapping nervously against stirrups. Elijah said nothing. Words would only feed the fire. Granger's eyes slid past him, catching sight of Atsa standing just behind the door. "Bring her out," he snarled. "We'll give her a fair trial." Elijah tightened his grip on the rifle. His heart pounded so loud he could barely hear over it, but his hands remained steady. "You come one step closer," he said, his voice low and deadly calm, "and it'll be the last step you take." The riders hesitated. Courage came easier in a mob, but even 5 men could feel the shadow of death when it stretched its fingers toward them. Granger barked a laugh, but it rang hollow in the cold. "You gonna fight all of us for some filthy squaw?" he jeered. Elijah didn't answer with words. He stepped off the porch. The message was clear. Behind him, Atsa moved. She lifted the rifle they had kept ready near the door, cradling it with the ease of long familiarity. Her stance was steady, her aim true. Granger's sneer faltered. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then, with a string of curses, Granger yanked his horse around. One by one, the riders followed, though their glances backward promised this was not the end. Elijah watched them until they disappeared into the falling snow, until the only sounds left were the whisper of wind through bare branches and the slow, steady drumbeat of his own heart. Inside, he and Atsa stoked the fire higher, setting pots of water to boil, checking the traps and the door latches again. They said little, but their movements were synchronized now, 2 parts of a single, battered whole. Night fell thick and heavy. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and another answered, and another, until the whole prairie seemed alive with their mourning. Elijah sat near the fire, cleaning his rifle with slow, methodical care. Atsa sat across from him, weaving thin strips of cloth into a bandolier for extra ammunition. Every so often, their eyes would meet across the firelight, and something wordless would pass between them, acknowledgement, gratitude, determination. The storm outside howled its fury, but within these 4 walls, there was only a stubborn, defiant kind of peace. They were no longer waiting to be saved. They were no longer running from fear. They were standing together. By the second nightfall, it was clear the riders were gathering again. Lights flickered on the horizon, torch flames guttering against the dark. The town, it seemed, had decided that righteousness could be bought with blood. Elijah and Atsa prepared as best they could. Boiling water to pour from the windows. Spikes set beneath fresh snow at the foot of the porch. Ropes strung low between trees to unseat riders. Every defense born not of malice, but of necessity. As the first torches appeared at the tree line, Elijah stood at the window, watching them come. Atsa came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. Her fingers were small and strong, her grip steady. Whatever came, they would meet it together. The first shot split the night. Elijah answered it. The fight that followed was not clean. It was not noble. It was desperate and ugly and full of the awful, necessary poetry of survival. Granger led the charge and fell first, his horse stumbling over a hidden rope, throwing him hard into the frozen earth. The others faltered, the shock of real resistance slowing their charge. Elijah moved like a man possessed, defending not land, not pride, but a fragile hope he refused to let them crush. Atsa moved with him, her aim sure, her spirit fierce. They fought not to win, but to endure. And when dawn crept gray and shivering over the broken landscape, the riders were gone, their torches quenched, their threats scattered like chaff before the wind. The cabin still stood. They still stood. Bruised. Bloodied. Unbroken. Elijah lowered his rifle, chest heaving, and turned to Atsa. She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw not the reflection of what they had fought off, but what they had fought for. A life carved not from hate or fear, but from the stubborn, miraculous belief that even in a world turned savage, kindness could still take root. The fire inside the cabin flared and snapped, chasing the chill back into the corners. Outside, the first pale hint of spring touched the edge of the sky. It was not over. It never would be. But as Atsa took his hand in hers and led him back toward the warmth and the waiting light, Elijah knew one unshakable thing. Together, they could weather anything the world dared throw their way. And tomorrow, when the sun rose fully over the battered hills, they would still be here. Still fighting. Still hoping. Still choosing love. The river ran fast with the melt of winter, a rush of cold and life that carved the earth with tireless hands. Its voice filled the morning, a low, ceaseless song that spoke of beginnings and endings, of journeys that would not be denied. Elijah Cutter knelt at its edge, scooping water into his hands, letting it run between his fingers like all the fears he could no longer carry. His reflection shivered in the ripples, a man hardened by survival, softened by something he dared now to call love. Behind him, Atsa moved through the trees, gathering roots and bark, her presence steady as the mountain that cradled the valley in its vast arms. The cabin, battered but unbroken, stood farther up the slope. Smoke curled from its chimney, a thin thread of defiance against the endless sky. It had been a week since the last attack. A week of cautious peace, of wounds tended and silences shared. But Elijah knew the world had not given up so easily. The night before, the widow Allen had come, wrapped in a cloak heavy with rain, her breath white against the darkness. "They're coming," she said simply. "More men. Hired guns. Strangers who don't care what reasons you have, only who pays their wage." Elijah had thanked her with a nod, his voice lost to the roaring in his ears. Atsa had pressed a hand to his chest afterward, feeling the thunder inside him, grounding him with the simple, wordless knowledge that he was not alone. Now, as he rose from the riverbank, water dripping from his fingertips, he felt no panic, only a clear, fierce certainty. He would not run. Not this time. Not ever again. He found Atsa at the edge of the clearing, her arms full of gathered medicine. She smiled faintly when she saw him, the kind of smile that said she understood everything he could not say. They returned to the cabin together, moving easily through the landscape that had become an extension of themselves. Every tree, every hollow, every blade of grass held their memory now. As the sun slipped lower, staining the sky with blood and gold, they prepared. The traps were set again, deeper this time, hidden beneath fallen leaves and loose stones. The narrow path leading up from the river was lined with snares and sharpened stakes. The cabin itself had been reinforced, shutters bolted, doors braced, every gap sealed against the cold and the enemy alike. Inside, the fire burned bright, and the smell of roasting venison filled the air. They sat close but did not touch, their connection beyond the need for constant reassurances now. Trust had woven itself into the very marrow of their bones. Atsa unwrapped a small bundle she had been saving, revealing 2 slender bands of woven leather and beads. She held them out, one in each hand, offering a piece of herself without demand. Elijah took the band she offered him and tied it around his wrist, the beads cool against his skin. Then, with clumsy fingers, he tied the second around hers. No words needed. No promises but the ones they had already made in every breath they took side by side. The night stretched long and restless. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying scents Elijah did not trust: sweat, gun oil, horses. They came just before dawn. There was no warning, no shouted threats or demands for surrender. Only the thunder of hooves and the crack of rifle fire. Elijah was ready. He fired from the upper window, striking the first rider before the man even had a chance to raise his weapon. The horse reared, screaming, and the others hesitated, long enough for Atsa's traps to spring, ropes tightening around legs, stakes rising from hidden pits. The battle was chaos. Gunfire shattered the silence. Horses screamed and men cursed and fell. Smoke choked the air, mixing with the rising mist from the river. Elijah fought like the river itself, relentless, unyielding, carving a path through those who sought to tear his life apart. Atsa moved beside him, quick and sure, reloading, passing ammunition, pulling him back from danger when fury threatened to blind him. They fought not for vengeance, not even for survival. They fought for the life they had built with bare hands and stubborn hope, for every night spent laughing quietly by the fire, for every morning that had begun with the simple, miraculous truth of still being there together. As the sun clawed its way over the horizon, the tide began to turn. The attackers, once so confident, found themselves facing more than a lone man and a wounded woman. They faced a home defended not by walls or weapons, but by something far harder to break. By love. By belonging. One by one, the hired guns fell back, bloodied and beaten, their courage no match for the fierce, unbreakable stand Elijah and Atsa made. The last to flee was a man whose face Elijah did not know, but whose eyes spoke of a life spent taking whatever was weaker than him. Their gazes met across the churned-up snow and broken branches, and for a moment, Elijah saw a reflection of what he might have become if he had chosen fear over faith. He did not raise his rifle. He did not need to. The man turned and fled, disappearing into the trees. Silence settled, broken only by the labored breathing of the earth itself. Elijah lowered his rifle, his hands trembling now that the need for violence had passed. Atsa came to him, pressing her forehead against his chest, her arms wrapping around him with a fierceness that nearly buckled his knees. They stood that way for a long time, the fire behind them, the river before them, and the wide, aching sky overhead. Later, they buried the dead with rough prayers and rougher hands, marking each grave with stones so that even those who had come to destroy might not be forgotten entirely. It was not forgiveness. It was simply the recognition that every soul, no matter how lost, had once been a child, had once known hope. When the work was done, they returned to the river. The water ran higher now, fed by the blood and sorrow of the morning, but it still sang its endless song, indifferent and eternal. Atsa knelt by the edge, washing her hands, letting the river carry away the blood and grime. Elijah joined her, his heart a strange, aching thing inside his chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the battered silver coin Samuel had given him so many years before. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the weight of all the roads that had led him here. Then, without ceremony, he tossed it into the river. The coin flashed once in the light, then disappeared into the depths. A letting go. A beginning. Atsa watched him, a small, knowing smile curving her mouth. They sat together on the riverbank, the sun warm against their backs, the wounds of the morning already beginning to knit themselves into the tapestry of their shared life. There would be more battles. More storms. The world would not change simply because two people dared to love in defiance of its cruelty. But within the walls of their cabin, on the banks of this river, in the shadow of this mountain, they had carved out a place that was theirs alone. A place where the past could not chain them. A place where the future, however uncertain, belonged to them and them alone. As the day faded into gold and lavender, they built a small fire by the water's edge. They cooked what little food they had, shared it without ceremony, and spoke in low voices about plans for the spring. Planting a garden, mending the roof, perhaps finding a way to trade with the distant Navajo settlements if peace could be brokered. Simple dreams. Radical dreams. Dreams made sacred by the blood and hope that had watered them. Night fell soft and velvet across the land. The stars woke slowly, blinking into existence one by one. Elijah lay back on the grass, his arm outstretched, his fingers brushing adzes where she lay beside him. They watched the sky together, breathing in rhythm, two small figures stubborn against the infinite vastness. After a long, comfortable silence, Elijah spoke. I used to think this world only knew how to take. Atsa turned her head toward him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. And now? She asked, voice barely more than a breath. He smiled, slow and sure. Now I know it can give back, he said, if you're brave enough to hold on. Atsa laced her fingers through his, anchoring him to the earth, to the sky, to the wild, beautiful ache of living. The river sang on. The mountain watched. And somewhere in the wide, listening darkness, the world shifted, just a little, to make room for two souls who had chosen, against every odd, to believe in the stubborn, breathtaking miracle of love.